In the summer of 1930, a group of American military officers gathered in a nondescript building in Washington, D.C., bent over maps of the Canadian border. They were not preparing for a training exercise. They were not responding to an immediate crisis. They were doing something far stranger, sketching out the invasion routes, naval blockade strategies, and economic warfare tactics that would be necessary if the United States ever went to war with the British Empire. At the time, this felt like prudent planning. Britain was still a global superpower. Its navy dominated the seas, and its territories surrounded American shores from Canada to the Caribbean. The officers working on what they called War Plan Red were not warmongers. They were professionals fulfilling what they believed was their duty, to be prepared for every contingency, no matter how unlikely. But as they drew their lines across maps, calculating how many divisions it would take to seize Halifax or how long a naval blockade of Britain might last, none of them could have known how quickly the world would shift beneath their assumptions. The plan they were creating would never be used. It would barely even be remembered. And yet for nearly a decade it existed in filing cabinets and strategic briefings, a ghost of a war that never came, haunting the edges of a friendship that would soon become the most important alliance of the 20th century. The world these officers inhabited was one suspended between memory and uncertainty. The First World War had ended just over a decade earlier, and its lessons were still being absorbed. The most powerful of those lessons was simple: never be caught unprepared again. The United States had entered that war late, scrambling to mobilize an army that barely existed, rushing troops across an ocean while learning modern warfare on the fly. The cost in lives and chaos had been staggering, and the military establishment was determined not to repeat the mistake. So they planned. They planned for war with Japan, which they called Plan Orange. They planned for war with Mexico, with Germany, with various coalitions and combinations. And yes, they planned for war with Britain, the nation that had burned Washington in 1812, the empire that still controlled Canada and maintained naval bases within striking distance of American cities. To the officers involved, this was not paranoia. It was professionalism. But the world they were planning for was already beginning to disappear. Britain in the late 1920s and early 1930s was not the confident imperial power it appeared to be. Beneath the pomp and the global reach, the empire was economically exhausted. The war debts from 1914 to 1918 were crushing. Payments to the United States were irregular and politically painful. The pound sterling, once the anchor of global finance, was under constant pressure. Industries were struggling, unemployment was rising. And across the empire, from India to Ireland, restless populations were demanding change. British military planners were themselves engaged in their own contingency exercises, including a plan called Defense Scheme No. 1, which imagined a rapid Canadian thrust into the United States to seize key cities before American mobilization could respond. It was as fantastical as War Plan Red, and just as seriously considered. Both nations were locked in a strange mutual dance, planning to fight each other while simultaneously depending on each other for trade, culture, and diplomatic stability. Neither government wanted war, but both militaries demanded readiness. And so the plans grew, fed by institutional momentum, professional obligation, and the gnawing sense that the world remained unpredictable and dangerous. What made War Plan Red more than a simple academic exercise was the genuine uncertainty about where British and American interests might collide. Trade rivalry was real. American industry was challenging British dominance in markets around the world. Naval competition was fierce, with both nations jockeying for advantage in treaties that limited warship tonnage and gun sizes. There were disputes over war debts, over access to oil in the Middle East, over influence in Latin America. None of these were reasons for war, but in the minds of military strategists trained to think in worst-case scenarios, they were fault lines that could widen under the right pressures. The plan itself grew steadily more detailed through the early 1930s. It envisioned a swift invasion of Canada, codenamed Crimson, designed to seize key ports and rail lines before British reinforcements could arrive. It included naval operations to blockade Britain, cutting off food and raw materials. It contemplated economic warfare, the disruption of trade routes, even the possibility of a long attritional struggle. Officers debated the feasibility of holding Canadian territory against insurgency. They argued over whether the U.S. Navy could successfully challenge the Royal Navy in the Atlantic while also defending against Japan in the Pacific. The disagreements were real, the concerns legitimate within the framework of their assumptions, but the framework itself was quietly becoming obsolete. Within the American military establishment, War Plan Red created deep ambivalence. The Navy, focused increasingly on the rising threat of Japan, saw it as a distraction. Resources spent refining scenarios for a war with Britain were resources not spent preparing for the conflict in the Pacific that seemed far more likely. The Army, responsible for any invasion of Canada, recognized the political and logistical nightmare such an operation would entail. How would the American public react to a war against the nation many still considered the mother country? How would you occupy a territory as vast as Canada without enormous casualties and a perpetual insurgency? The War College used Plan Red as a teaching tool, forcing officers to think through complex strategic problems, but many instructors were uncomfortable with the premise. Meanwhile, the State Department was quietly horrified. Diplomats working to improve relations with Britain, to coordinate responses to global economic crisis and rising threats in Europe and Asia, saw the very existence of such planning as diplomatically toxic. If it ever leaked, it would humiliate both governments and damage the trust they were painstakingly building. And so the plan existed in a strange limbo, continuously updated, occasionally referenced, but never quite taken seriously and never quite abandoned. The questions that War Plan Red never fully answered are perhaps more revealing than the plan itself. What would actually trigger such a war? Officers could sketch invasion routes, but they struggled to articulate a plausible scenario in which democratic publics in both nations would support armed conflict against each other. Economic competition, yes. Naval rivalry, certainly. But war? The gap between strategic planning and political reality was enormous, and everyone involved knew it. There was also the problem of cost. Both nations were struggling through the Great Depression. Britain could barely afford its existing military commitments, let alone a war against the world's largest industrial economy. The United States, despite its economic strength, was deeply isolationist, its public and Congress resistant to military spending and foreign entanglements. A war with Britain would require mobilization on a scale that seemed politically impossible. And then there was the growing shadow that military planners in both countries were beginning to notice: Germany. By the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler's rearmament program was accelerating. Japan's aggression in China was intensifying, the strategic landscape was shifting, and the hypothetical conflict between Britain and America was looking less like a contingency and more like an anachronism. Yet the plan was never formally canceled. There was no meeting where senior officials gathered to declare War Plan Red obsolete. There was no memo circulated announcing its termination. Instead, it simply faded. Updates became less frequent. Resources were quietly redirected. By 1938, War College instructors had stopped using it in their courses. By 1939, with Hitler's invasion of Poland and Britain's declaration of war against Germany, the entire premise had become absurd. The nation that American officers had been planning to fight was now the nation America would need as an ally. The invasion routes sketched across Canadian maps were forgotten. The naval blockade strategies were shelved. And the officers who had spent years refining War Plan Red now turned their attention to the very real wars unfolding in Europe and Asia. The institutional machinery simply moved on, leaving the plan to gather dust in classified archives, unremembered and unlamented. The irony, of course, is that the planning process itself may have been more valuable than anyone realized at the time. Working through the logistics of amphibious invasions, coordinating Army and Navy operations, thinking through the challenges of projecting power across vast distances, these were skills that American military planners would desperately need just a few years later. The very same officers who had imagined storming Canadian beaches would soon be planning the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, working alongside the British commanders they had once theoretically opposed. The coordination problems identified in War Plan Red, the disputes between services, the challenges of joint operations, the complexities of supply lines, were addressed and refined, creating institutional knowledge that proved invaluable when real wars demanded real solutions. In a strange way, planning for the wrong war may have helped America prepare for the right one. When War Plan Red was finally declassified in 1974, It caused a brief media sensation. Journalists marveled at the audacity of planning a war against America's closest ally. Historians debated its significance, some seeing it as evidence of American imperial ambition, others as merely routine military contingency planning. The Canadian public was bemused to learn that their southern neighbor had once contemplated invasion, just as the American public was surprised to discover that Canada had its own plans to invade the United States. But the sensation faded quickly, absorbed into the footnotes of history. What remained was a deeper lesson about the nature of strategic planning and historical contingency. The officers who created War Plan Red were not fools. They were responding rationally to the world as they understood it, a world where alliances seemed fragile, where economic rivalry could escalate unpredictably, where the memory of past conflicts, 1776-1812, still shaped national consciousness. They could not see the future. They could not know that the greatest threats would come not from historic rivals, but from rising powers in Germany and Japan. They could not predict that the very bases and territories they planned to seize would soon become joint defensive positions in a global struggle against fascism. The Canadian border that American officers studied so carefully in 1930, mapping invasion corridors and strategic choke points, is today the longest undefended frontier in the world. The trust between the United States and Britain, which seemed so conditional in the planning documents of War Plan Red, became the foundation of the Western alliance structure that defined the second half of the 20th century. The naval competition that fueled mutual suspicion gave way to integrated command structures and shared intelligence networks, and the officers who once gamed out scenarios of mutual destruction became architects of mutual defense. History did not follow the path that War Plan Red anticipated, but neither did the plan's existence prevent the alliance that eventually formed. The two realities coexisted: militaries planning for conflict while diplomats built cooperation, strategic paranoia alongside growing friendship, contingency preparations unfolding in parallel with deepening interdependence. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of War Plan Red is how reasonable it seemed at the time and how absurd it appears in hindsight. This gap between contemporary logic and historical outcome is a reminder of how opaque the future always is, how confidently we plan for scenarios that never materialize, how the threats we prepare for are often not the threats we face. The officers working on War Plan Red were doing exactly what they were trained to do, what their institutions demanded, what their professional obligations required. They were not trying to create a war, they were trying to be ready for one. But readiness itself is a strange concept, especially when the war you are preparing for is one that political, economic, and cultural forces are simultaneously making less and less likely. The plans existed in a realm separate from policy, where military logic operated on different assumptions than diplomatic reality. And in that separation lay both the value and the danger of contingency planning. The war between the United States and Britain never came. The plans were never used. The scenarios never unfolded. And yet for nearly a decade they existed as possibilities, filed away in classified documents, discussed in strategy sessions, refined and updated by officers who took their work seriously. War Plan Red was not a policy. It was not a prediction. It was a hedge against uncertainty in an uncertain world. And when the world clarified, when the real threats emerged and the necessary alliances became obvious, the plan simply dissolved, not with a decision, but with a quiet shift in attention and resources. The filing cabinets remained, but the minds that had created the plans moved on to other wars, other challenges, other futures. What remains now is not the plan itself, but the reminder that history is filled with roads not taken, wars not fought, crises not realized. We remember what happened. We construct narratives of inevitability. But the archives hold evidence of all the other possibilities that once seemed real, the contingencies that shaped planning even as events made them irrelevant. War Plan Red is one of those ghosts. A war that never was, a crisis that never came, a turning point that never turned. And in its very obsolescence lies its deepest lesson, that the future is always more surprising than our preparations for it, and that the wars we avoid may shape history as profoundly as the wars we fight.